Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda.
What do the Venezuela operation and the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which happened 5 years ago, tell us about President Donald Trump? The anniversary of January 6th and the insurrection and uprising that occurred that goes on when Congress comes back into session with the background of what just happened in Venezuela, I think completely captures the reckless endangerment of others by this president and how he acts, said David McEwen, a political science professor at Sonoma State University. Does he think that the Venezuela raid will defy Trump's foreign policy legacy and America's and its allies' place in the world? Listen to our conversation.
If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate.
David, my original intention was to talk to you about the 5th anniversary of the Capitol attack on January 6, 2021. The US President Donald Trump was clearly against us having such a conversation, so he invaded Venezuela and had Nicolas Maduro kidnapped. But in all seriousness, what does this mean to you? Could Venezuela come to define Trump's foreign policy legacy and America's place in the world?
You know, this has been a very curious 3 or 4 weeks. What got Donald Trump into the presidency was the state of the economy, was affordability, was issues around the pocketbook for American voters. In the last 3 or 4 weeks, he's emphasized foreign policy, right? Discussions about Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, what's going on in the Pacific Rim and Indo-Pacific theater with China. And then, of course, culminating in what happened over the weekend with taking Maduro in Venezuela. And foreign policy, it was an issue that Donald Trump talked about America first in relationship to the economy, and that there would be no foreign wars or interventions. And what is clear after this, there are both short-term and longer-term implications. Here, there are what we might call serious knock-on effects. And these are going to have immediate and long-ranging costs, I think, to America's allies and to our commitment. That's particularly important, I think, for Europe and European allies. And in the disarray of their discussion, in their press conferences, Secretary of State Marco Rubio going across the Sunday morning talk shows yesterday, there was a real lack of clarity about the plan. And what comes up in that is who's next? Is it going to be Colombia? Is it going to be Mexico? Is it going to be Cuba? Is it going to be Greenland? And if they're going to talk about and do these things, then what you're also talking about is the destruction, I would argue, of NATO and the destruction of a rules-based international system that served our interests and served to largely provide peace in Europe and across the world with obviously proxy wars. You've been to the DMZ and North and South Korea. You've seen some of these places where the Cold War has become hot. But this is an inflection point for the Trump presidency. You're right that it could come to define the next 3 years. Congress comes back into session in less than 24 hours. They want to talk about healthcare. They want to talk about affordability. They don't want to talk about the Epstein files. And what's going to dominate now is going to be foreign policy. So in some ways, as we kick off 2026, for the mother of all midterms, November 2026, as we kick this off, we are in a weird place, an unusual place, with deep, deep implications for world order that spill out beyond what happened in Venezuela and affect our many friends and allies across the world.
So why this shift?
I think the shift has happened for a couple of reasons. One is there's a curious kind of emphasis in political science about why most modern American presidents are failures. That is, they come into office, perhaps buoyed by popularity, and sometimes they leave office and they're more popular. But in the actual administration of the office, it becomes very costly to them. Domestic affairs get messy. The security presidency, the post 9/11 presidency gets messy. And certainly foreign affairs provide them some latitude, right? The old Aaron Wadowski 2 presidencies hypothesis. But there's really 3 presidencies, and that's the domestic affairs presidency, there's the foreign policy presidency or foreign affairs presidency, and there's the security presidency. And the security presidency allows the president a lot of unilateral activity. We've talked about this in terms of the unitary executive hypothesis. But what that means is you conduct a military raid involving over 150 planes, involving all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, and you conduct this at the behest of law enforcement based upon a legal ruling that goes on, a legal precedent, if you will, that they're trying to establish that they're helping law enforcement. And what's ironic about this is that while foreign affairs and security affairs give them a lot of latitude, right? It gave Obama a lot of latitude around drones and drone activity in the global war on terror. It's given presidents since 9/11 a lot of latitude. But the argument that Trump administration is making, first about drugs, then about oil and U.S. national security and U.S. national interests. And then the reason they go in is because law enforcement works too slowly. That these indictments that have been around since 2020 against Maduro, his wife and family, have not been enforced by the United States, they argue, and therefore needed to be changed. And the way to do that is through military force, but they're going back to, and based upon an indictment of U.S. action that is a court order, they're going back to the legal. Well, this is clearly extra-legal, extrajudicial, and in that place, it flies in the face of international law, the UN Charter, and is a challenge even in U.S. law for how they conducted this raid. And the reason they did it is because it provides some latitude. I also want to kind of back up here. It's unclear what Congress can do in response. There is this War Powers Resolution, this War Powers Act, where both sides kind of play a game of chicken. The president claims he doesn't have to abide by it. This isn't unique to Trump, but in the process of doing that says, look, we're going to notify you within a few days, kind of keeping in the spirit of the War Powers Act. And then what's Congress do? Do they not fund things? Do they pull people back? What does that look like? And none of this ever reaches the Supreme Court, where the proponents of the War Powers Act pretty much believe that they would lose, given where this court is at in terms of executive authority and executive power. So the Trump administration, this president, has filled the breach. They've run into that place. And what is uncertain are the long-term and short-term, near-term kind of knockoff effects of what comes next.
You mentioned Congress, and of course, Congress was not informed about the operation in Venezuela. From the outside, it appears that the U.S. president can use military force as he pleases. And of course, Trump is not the first U.S. president to do so. But is this also a sign of, let's say, Trump's imperial presidency and his autocratic tendencies, especially when we consider that, according to the Supreme Court, the U.S. president now enjoys essentially unlimited presumptive immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts?
They're beyond pushing the envelope here. The term is they've jumped a shark is the term. And they have moved to a place where they are more than acting unilaterally. They're acting in an autocratic fashion, determining what things look like. As Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said, they're moving to a place of action. Don't deny that this president would engage in this type of action. But the serious consequences here are deep. They're deep not just because of these violations of international law or the UN Charter. They're deep because these are similar arguments to what Vladimir Putin made about Russian national interests relative to Ukraine and a war that is reaching, it's almost fourth anniversary next month. This is a similar argument that you could see the Chinese government making in relationship to Taiwan or to islands in the Philippines and to other areas where they want to extend their national interests. And if you look at the U.S. national security strategy that was released by the Trump administration last month, you see some interesting aspects to it. One is they talk about the Monroe Doctrine, or what they're calling the Donroe Doctrine in honor of Donald Trump, and the Trump corollary, where the first region they mention is the Western Hemisphere. And in the Western Hemisphere, they engage and explicitly say they're going to have a strategy of what's called enlist and expand. They're going to enlist friends. They're going to enjoin those friends. They're going to use those friends. And then they're going to expand U.S. influence. And that expansion of U.S. influence is economic. It is focused on economic interests and U.S. companies and growing markets, but backed by the force of a gun. backed by U.S. actions that are an all-hands-on-deck effort to move forward U.S. interests. That runs the risk of looking colonial and imperial, to your point, and that is where history has not been kind. Where I find some difficulty with this, you're a responsible, learned analyst of foreign relations and security relations, not the United States, everywhere, including the United States, across the world, and how it's important for Central Europe, but more broadly for security and what that looks like for democracy. When you see Marco Rubio come on to television yesterday, he talks about people don't understand Venezuela, that they treat Venezuela like the Middle East. They treat Venezuela like Iraq, or they treat Venezuela like Libya or Syria, and therefore they're not understanding the situation. And it's that type of unserious arrogance without a plan that they clearly are making up as they go along, because Marco Rubio is now the czar of Venezuela. He is the head of what is going on de facto, even though he is not the vice president ascendant for the nation of Venezuela. And that presents some real sticky problems, especially because oil in Venezuela, that industry was nationalized 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago, in 1976. And when it was nationalized, it's had problems since 1998, 2002. It's had different episodes where it hasn't modernized for that sweet, heavy crude that's very valuable but hard to refine. And it's not just a nation of 30 million people. It's a nation that has the world's largest proven oil reserves. And clearly that harkens back to things that we have seen in our history that have been problematic in terms of administration of what comes after the initial action. That's not Iraq, that's not Afghanistan, that's not Syria or Libya. It is different. He's right about that aspect, but that's where his righteousness ends, because there are some difficulties there that even American companies and the American government cannot ignore or go away from in terms of the administration of what comes next. And so that means it dominates this year in terms of foreign policy, and it moves other things to the background, including NATO's future, including Ukraine, including what happens in other areas of the world like the Middle East or the Indo-Pacific.
So how should U.S. allies assess this? How sustainable is the situation in which NATO member Denmark has to repeatedly respond to Trump's statements about taking over Greenland?
Yeah, okay. If we were to make moves to take over Greenland, which seems crazy on its face, it is the effective, obviously, end of NATO. That's the obvious point. But you don't need to take over Greenland to leverage influence in Greenland if you think of it as a strategic area, if that's the argument. They put that argument out there sometimes, but I'm not sure that they're serious about it. It's more about the acquisition of real estate. And the acquisition of real estate and what that looks like would signal the United States, Russia, China, that has carved up the world into three areas. And when you carve up the Western Hemisphere for the United States, when you carve up a big part of the world to Russia and to Putin, and then you carve up the Indo-Pacific for the Chinese, that leaves your area of the world, that leaves Europe somewhat in the middle. It leaves the Middle East a bit unclear, where all three powers would certainly battle, but it also spells, I think, the end of NATO. And it is this implication that you've written about, that we've talked about, that many of us have been writing and thinking and talking about for a long time. It has NATO really changed its place in terms of security, in terms of peace, nation building, and its role. And the Trump administration is not going to recognize international law or the UN to serve in that rules-based administration, which means what they have done. And what began, as you recall, in February of last year in Munich, when Vice President J.D. Vance appeared and then Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, they declared a new relationship with Europe that was beyond budgets, that was beyond spending and the values represented by budgets for defense. It was a place that put everyone on notice, and they've continued to walk away from that. And that is going to be costly, not just in American blood and treasure. That's going to be costly in terms of our best friends and allies' blood and treasure as well. And I think this is an inflection point, a moment, a tipping point for the U.S. role in the world, because the implications of this downstream are uncertain in terms of benefits and really certain in terms of costs. because it is going to be very, very difficult for our allies to assess U.S. commitment and U.S. credibility.
David, as I understand it well, you think that what the US did in Venezuela gives some room for maneuvers also to China, for example, Russia, others. But also I hear from some observers that it doesn't matter that much because big powers are doing big powers things all the time. China won't care that much about Venezuela. They will just do whatever they want to do in Taiwan if they want to do something. The same with Russia. So how will you respond to this?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a couple of elements here that I think make this a little bit different. One is that this move crystallizes with the release of the U.S. national security strategy last month, how far the Trump administration is willing to go to protect near shore interests, regional interests, Western Hemisphere interests. So that brings to mind not what is happening solely in Colombia or Cuba, but what happens in Mexico. Same situation, similar issues, southern border, big commitment, and obviously an area that's received a lot of attention relative to immigration. That makes the strategy of retaking the Panama Canal, bringing it back to the United States unilaterally, a huge deal. It puts it on the table for this administration. And those are game changers. And the reason those are game changers is because nations like China have been operating in Latin America, in the two areas I just mentioned, as well as farther south. The Russians have been trying to leverage influence where we're not at, whether that's in the Sahel, whether that's in Mali, whether that's working with ISIS elements or other elements, Nigeria, which we bombed recently, as your listeners know. And it also sends a signal to China that it's not a policy of strategic ambiguity, which is where the United States has been relative to Taiwan for several administrations now, but a policy that is potentially reckless and uncertain. And so the Chinese are trying to figure out how to navigate this. And what I'll point to is that the Chinese government is trying to set up a one-on-one, nation-to-nation summit between the United States and China, in China, with President Trump in later April. Well, that gets pushed back, or that gets a little bit more uncertain, and stakes for that are huge. In addition, you have the APEC, the APEC summit later this year. You have the G20 later this year. That's November, December. So there are a lot of things, I would argue, in the background that are percolating about what comes next to determine the U.S. role in the world, which the Trump administration is talking about as America first, but it looks like America takes and pushes. And when that happens, it provides a great deal of uncertainty to all of these other nations. And in the background of all of this is Vladimir Putin still operating in Ukraine and still dealing with issues relative to his influence for America's adversaries, which can include Iran, which troubles the Israelis, and then the Chinese are around all of this. So the bigger point here is the instability of perhaps this downplaying this action. I think doesn't appreciate what is happening here and what is going on at a deeper, more fundamental level. This is challenging and making very clear that America's commitment to others waxes and wanes and is uncertain. And again, that's returns to our credibility and our commitment, and its credibility and commitment protected by that nuclear umbrella and protected by respectful relations with other nations that have driven U.S. foreign policy and U.S. security policy in positive ways for us and the world for the last 60, 70 years. And I think that is all starting to not crumble, but it's certainly beginning to disintegrate.
Interestingly, we hear voices, for example, also from Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, claiming that it is in a way refreshing that Trump openly stated that the operation in Venezuela is about oil and not about democracy. But I really don't see this as any kind of silver lining in what could clearly be perceived as a colonial and imperialistic policy. Do you? Do you see any silver lining?
I think there are a few silver linings, but not about the plain speaking nature. On the positive side, Maduro was a dictator. He's behind bars. That's good. That's a good thing for democracy and human rights. There was a tremendous, flawless military exercise and execution of a very dangerous mission that demonstrated to others what we're capable of. And that's an important element. Is it a capability argument or is it a deterrence-related argument? That I'm not sure of. but it will obviously influence other government officials in Venezuela who are still there. And lastly, it may change the drug trade in Latin America. It may change what is going on in both the Pacific and the Atlantic sides of the canal, I'll say, both in the Caribbean, Atlantic area and the Pacific area. That could have downstream effects relative to other cartels. So there are some positives given the oil situation there and the oil production administration there. You're talking about something that's going to take years to bring up, to test, to resolve through the courts, and then to implement. And it easily, a worst case scenario could be 8 to 10 years, 7 to 8 on the short term, 9 to 10 on the long term. In the worst case scenario, for getting oil out of there that's reliable, that provides to markets, that's big. And that's because they've been operating at about 15 to 20% capacity. And the reason they've been operating at such low capacity is because of the infrastructure that's there. That's not going to gin up overnight. It's going to take some time and some resolution. And also there's going to be the problems endemic to the Maduro government that you have to resolve as well. And so this is a really big deal. Can the Trump administration turn this into a Marshall Plan for Latin America? Could it turn this into a bigger plan that alters the economies of nations that have huge drug cartels operating in, let's say Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, including Venezuela? Perhaps. And could there be a Marshall Plan for the Western Hemisphere? If they had deep thinkers going on there, I'd say I might give them some credit for that, but they're not at that point. And we haven't seen tendencies or indications of that. What this looks like is a raid to free up oil and remove Maduro, and the secondary or corollary effects might be related to drugs and other security elements. Those are peripheral security interests, I'd say. They're not core national security interests, and that's where the seriousness of what has taken place is an important element.
Frankly speaking, I absolutely don't believe that the Trump administration will be able to put together something like the Marshall Plan for Latin America. They might give some money to some leaders that they favor, but I absolutely don't believe they will be willing to come up with something more substantial.
Yeah, I mean, they would have this opportunity, but that's not their framework. That's not their mindset for what could happen and what they could do. This thing comes together ad hoc, is an opportunity. They take advantage of it. They put Congress in a bind. The American people are split on this. If they're Republican, they are supportive, but not deep. If the MAGA, they're concerned, but they have rallied behind him. And if they're Democrats or independents, they're worried about what comes next. Because, and this is also, I would argue, Andres, driven by generation. Young people, those that are under 30, 35, for most of their life, we've been at war. And so there's also, I think, a deep concern about where the nation is headed and what that looks like. And so to see the administration taking advantage of trying to create a Marshall-type plan for the Western Hemisphere, it's a core element of that U.S. national security strategy, page 15 of a 33-page document. I mean, it leads right off in terms of what they're doing. I don't see them, frankly, I agree with you. I don't see them doing this either.
And finally, David, I think that regardless of the outcome, the Venezuela operation was a clear violation of international law. And 5 years ago, Trump's rhetoric led to the Capitol riot, and he later pardoned the attackers, whom I would describe as insurrectionists. Does Trump respect any internal or external rules and norms at all? And if he doesn't, what does it mean for the future of American democracy?
Okay, that is a fabulous question to end with. He is a transactional, self-absorbed, non-reflective, unreflective guy, a person who believes in his own self-righteousness. And that means that his adherence to not just norms or customs or what we call mores, his adherence to the rule of law is non-existent. And therefore, they have used a situation here, and I've been talking to a lot of media about this. What's Congress going to do? They have a real ineffectiveness in terms of response. And he also doesn't just control the bully pulpit of the presidency, the narrative of the nation and where we're going. He controls the ability to pardon lawbreakers, criminals, insurrectionists, as you, I think, rightly described them. And we believe, for those of us that are doing this research on political violence in the United States, we believe that there's a lot of people who share his point of view. They may not be regular voters. They may not be, willing to shoot others, but they're willing to show up and protest and push the edge of the frame of violence. And that becomes a very difficult governance set. And he wants to therefore govern by emotion in that way. And it's that governance by emotion that I think is unsettling to all of us who are serious people about world affairs, about security, and about the United States. And therefore, the anniversary of January 6th and the insurrection and uprising that occurred, that goes on tomorrow when Congress comes back into session, with the background of what just happened in Venezuela, I think completely captures the reckless endangerment of others by this president and how he acts. And that's a real problem moving forward. He also, as you know, is naming a lot of things and doing a lot of things that are ego strokes, if you will. That signals to me that he wants his name on things before he leaves in 2028. So there's no third term, but it emboldens someone like a J.D. Vance and others in this administration, I think, which can further destabilize where we're headed.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.